All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Alan Rutberg, the director of the Center for Animals and Public Policy here at the Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine. This is the first of our the center's public speaker series for the year, the Animal Matters series. We have an additional schedule coming up, so later in October we'll have Chelsea Shively of the USDA actually talking about antimicrobial resistance, and so we have a nice series set up for this year. So today our first speaker is Dr. Jennifer Jacquet. Okay, and Dr. Jacquet is at the University of Miami. She's a professor at the Rosenstiel School of Marine, Atmospheric, and Earth Sciences, as well as being a affiliated faculty at the Abbas Center for Ecosystem Science and Policy. So she was the recipient of the 2015 Alfred Sloan Research Fellowship in Ocean Science, a 2016 Pew Fellowship in Marine Conservation, which maybe is how you encountered Heidi. And she's also most recently the author of the playbook, How to Deny Science, Sell Lies, and Make a Killing in the Corporate World. So my kind of person, thank you for kicking us off.
Thank you. Thank you. I won't be talking too much about the playbook, but I am interested in sort of policy obstruction. And that book is very much about sort of corporate malfeasance, written by my alter ego, a corporate consultant. Today I am here as my real self. And I actually know Heidi through Dale Jamieson, who is the founder and director of this Center for Environmental and Animal Protection at NYU, and also the Department of Environmental Studies there. And a lot of what I am talking about today very much comes out of conversations with him and even work that we've done together, as well as I trained with Daniel Pauly at the Sea Around Us project at the University of British Columbia for my PhD. He has a fisheries project that he tried to sort of elevate fisheries through this project to a global system, using global data sets, taking a very bird's eye view of fisheries, similar to sort of the climate system. And again, a lot of this work would not be possible without his vision and his data. So thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time to the Tufts Vet School, and also really excited about the CAT program. Let's see here if I can advance. So my title today is Fish Are Not Natural Resources, and it's actually an homage. Let's see here. I know you told me that I just pressed this, but maybe I'm doing something wrong.
No. With the most one first.
Okay. Okay, there we go. And the title is an homage to Dale Jamieson, a paper he and Tom Reagan wrote exactly 40 years ago, called Whales Are Not Cetacean Resources. And this was a paper written right after the IWC moratorium on commercial whaling. And I'll circle back to what this paper argues for, but to me, it's a very pertinent frame for thinking about aquatic animals more generally. So how we talk about fish, as you know from studying them as vet students, as master students, says a lot about how we see them as animals. I studied them from a fisheries perspective, which meant that they were referred to always in the scientific literature as natural resources, renewable resources, seafood, the concept of surplus production, or the amount of seafood that you would harvest in a given year being the surplus production in a maximum sustainable yield model, referred to as stocks all the time as our whales, still in some cases. Commodities, I used the term harvest already, caught, killed, bycatch, trash fish, bait fish, game fish. The concept of being underfished is a very common frame used by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, that for pristine or untouched, underexploited species, that they are underfished because we have not tried to implement an MSY model and harvest them in a sustainable fashion. Okay, so that's all the language. Should be sort of familiar language if you're used to studying forestry or other forms of even agronomy. And we can step back, I think, given that you're familiar with animal production generally, food production probably to some extent, and recognize just as an initial first order fact that it really isn't about food production. It's often about distribution of food, as to why we have hunger around the world. And so we have mountains of science now to indicate that we are living in, some people live in food, us in America, surplus environments. Other people live in areas of potential famine. This has very little to do with the global food availability, much more to do with how that food is distributed. And in the US and other Western countries and places like China, we know that a lot of crops are grown for animal feed each year. Only about 12% of these ultimately contribute to the human diet. And globally, calorie availability could be increased by shifting crops away from animal feed to biofuels and biofuels to human consumption. This is, of course, also true when it comes to aquaculture production, because as we try to lower the amount of fish meal and fish oil in aquaculture, we are increasing those terrestrial plant-based feeds. So all of that is to put a frame around this to say, we really should dig into the empirics of these claims. And with fisheries and fish and claiming fish are natural resources there to feed the world, you see this said repeatedly all the time in the academic literature, in the popular literature. Aquaculture is critical. Here you have the Nature Conservancy saying aquaculture is critical for feeding the world in a changing climate. NPR, can farm fish feed the world without destroying the environment? Here's a Capture Fisheries article from the Journal of Marine Science, ICES, Feeding the World, What Role for Fisheries? We take these comments for granted. They're made by gigantic NGOs, they're made by universities, they're made by scientists. And I would argue there's very little good empirical data about who fish actually feed, both wild caught and aquaculture. And I'm going to talk about them sort of together and then try to tease them apart a little bit. When we look at FAO, so the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, established in 1950 out of post World War II, sort of new global vision. They don't do a great job of establishing where all the fish in the world goes, but here is a perfect example of from the SOFIA report of 2022 showing that fisheries resources are going mainly to high income countries when we are talking about the global seafood system, and non-high income countries are accounting for a much smaller percent of the overall seafood trade. The top 10 importing countries of aquatic products by value, as you can see here, are ones that are not generally considered food insecure by any means. So then you start thinking, okay, well, it's still food. It might not be essential, but it's still food. I think we need a much better view of what is a kind of luxury product traded, designed to make money versus something that is essential for calories or really important to kind of daily sustenance. So one of the things that we've argued for is just better reporting and data on the end use of aquatic products. And I've helped in my own small way with this, noticing that CAMLAR, which is the organization that oversees fisheries in Antarctica. If we think about the Antarctic Treaty System, it has carve-outs for instance, whales. Whaling is not allowed in the CAMLAR region. it has a seal treaty. The exploitation of seals is not allowed, but it has this other treaty called CAMLAR that's designed to manage sustainably fish and invertebrate resources in Antarctica. So while you cannot kill seals, penguins, whales, you can kill toothfish and krill in Antarctica. And that also shows you, again, kind of a gap in the way that we're thinking. And they've argued on their website, or did previously, that the convention area, it makes a valuable contribution to global food security. This seemed highly suspect to me, given that what I knew of Patagonian toothfish or Chilean sea bass, one of the exploited species in Antarctica, selling for $40 a pound at my local Whole Foods. It didn't seem like a global food security argument. We worked together with a PhD student and published a paper on how high seas fisheries in general, including Antarctica specifically. High seas is the area beyond national jurisdiction, about 2/3 of the global ocean. How these fisheries actually go to feed high-income, well-fed countries. They are, in general, higher value species than species caught within EEZs or national waters. And they might be processed in a place like Thailand, but they're ultimately consumed in places like the European Union, Japan, and the United States. Okay, we also know that global fish catch in general, and this is catch, the colored part is a reconstructed catch. The black bar is the Food and Agriculture Organization's reported catch for the globe. The unofficial statistics, these are the sea around us data, are quite a bit higher because in general, FAO has ignored some small scale and subsistence fisheries that are still quite large once you aggregate them. So I like the reconstructed data, but in any case, the trend here is what's important. We have more and more fishing effort, better and better technologies, and yet we have seen a peak in global fish catch and a slow decline since about the early 90s, and despite increasing effort. So we know we've exceeded some of the natural boundaries of fisheries, regardless of whether or not you see them as natural resources or as animals. And we also know that the fish system is dominated right now by industrial production. So industrial fisheries account for at least 73% of global fish catch. Only about 2% of the catch, 2 to 3%, is subsistence fisheries, meaning it does not enter a commodities market. It goes to feed the fishers or their families, their communities, without going through the marketplace. A lot of small scale fisheries, meaning they don't use as intensive fishing gears, still enter the marketplace, but may not be as globally exported as industrial fisheries. So this is the breakdown by end use, industrial being this big dark blue chunk there. And at the same time, there's a real growing recognition of fish sentience. This is probably an exciting area for many of you. It is for me to watch this because when I started my PhD in 2005, there was not much information out there. Now, I just recently assigned this wonderful review by Colin Brown, reviewing the literature just for fish intelligence, sentience, and ethics. You probably know this popular book by Jonathan Balcom, What a Fish Knows. There's a lot more momentum being gained toward what Dale and I would call ASC science, agency, sentience, and cognition research for both fish and aquatic invertebrates. At the same time, there's a kind of a kind of pushback or try to recognize a recognition that this kind of work challenges the industrial behemoth fishery complex that is out there in the world. So this is Ben Goldfarb. I love his writing. Many of you will know it because he writes a lot about animals and all sorts of different outlets. He was reviewing What a Fish Knows, and he makes the following statement. Balcom stops just short of following this argument to its logical conclusion that commercial and recreational fishing are unconscionably inhumane. And truthfully, I'm not sure that they are. Every form of food production incurs ethical and environmental cost. And what is fishing but another predator-prey relationship? I want you to be sort of aware of this argument because it is one that's frequently made. And I think it is offering a false equivalency, a kind of logical fallacy. First of all food production does have costs, but those costs are not equal across different food production systems. Not true across aquatic animals, and then not true across aquatic animals, terrestrial animals, and terrestrial plants or aquatic plants. And there's plenty of growing areas of research to point this out. Some of you might be interested in it. This is a research study by Ben Halpern's team in Nature Sustainability, showing foods that are of low impact but high production, others that are high impact, low production, high impact, high production. Low impact, low production is probably the things I'm seeing around here, the raspberries and the blueberries driving in that were so nice. This is just to say that they were only looking at freshwater use, habitat disturbance, nutrient pollution, greenhouse gases. They weren't looking at things like bycatch, impacts on other wild animals, or other factors that you could build into these models. Even then, there's wide variation across the impacts of foods that I think we have to keep readily available in our minds, that not all food production has equal impacts. There's also a blind spot in terms of animal welfare issues generally. So not all forms of food production have animal welfare concerns. Those typically come with, of course, animal production. And of course, even in some cases, feed production for animals has knock-on effects for wild animal welfare. Similarly, just regular legumes. But in the case of actually growing aquatic animals, the blind spot for animal welfare is gigantic. Some of you will know this as well as I do, given your studies. But we recently published a paper in Science Advances, Becca Franks was the lead, about the 408 species that are under production currently, aquatic species. And this is 20 times the number of farmed terrestrial animals. And it represents an order of magnitude more individuals. But that specialized welfare information was only available for 84 of those species at all, about 30% of the individuals that are being farmed. The remaining 70% of species being farmed they have no welfare publications or were unknown. And just to drill into that again, we looked across the ISI Web of Science, and most of the species, again, are sort of unknown in the FAO data set for aquaculture. But for the ones that we know exact species of, for many of them, there was no welfare information whatsoever, or little welfare, somewhere between 1 and 4 papers. For the species in which there were more than 5 papers in the scientific literature, species like Atlantic salmon, that still does nothing, of course, to guarantee their welfare. So we're just talking about what is the basis for welfare science here, not even how well is it being implemented. Some of you may be familiar with the undercover investigations that are going on primarily in Scotland. These were photos taken there of Scottish fish farms. It's pretty gruesome what people are finding with underwater cameras there in terms of the welfare concerns of Atlantic salmon. Mold in the eyes, pathogens, aggression, sea lice, and again, you can see sort of swimming corpses in these cases. Another false equivalency argument you'll come across is that, well, humans are just another predator. We know that this is a common argument. It's been made since the anti-whaling efforts. This is a book by Frank Zelko, a historian of science. He wrote this history of Greenpeace that is wonderful. But in one part of the book, he mentions that that if one accepted that whales were part of the broader ecosystem, then no matter how harmoniously they lived within that system, it was hard to argue that humans should not be allowed to hunt them. After all, whales themselves were hunters. And one of the key tenets of holistic ecology is that no individual creature, neither human nor whale, should be viewed as more important than the ecosystem to which it belongs. So from this perspective, arguing that humans should never kill whales, which was the Greenpeace position, particularly if they weren't endangered, something like the minke whale, it was as absurd as arguing that it was morally wrong for orcas to kill seals or rip apart baby humpbacks. It was a philosophical dilemma that groups such as Greenpeace would grapple with for years to come. And to be honest, this is still being said around any sort of fishery issue as well. But what's really exciting is the recent science that shows that humans are predators that operate far outside the boundaries of what's sort of average in the natural world. So I want to introduce a few other pieces of evidence. One is that humans, Homo sapiens, are a relatively recent marine predator at all. We have the first evidence of humans, or early hominids at least, collecting intertidal organisms from the ecosystem is only 165,000 years old. Our first evidence of fishing is only 80,000 years old. I know this sounds like a long time because terrestrial farming is only about 5,000 years old, but it should hopefully frame us as mainly having evolved in the terrestrial environment, which we know to be true. Pelagic fishing is only 42,000 years old. This is a neat study about the earliest found fish hooks for tuna. We know this was very important for the spread of humans across Polynesia and into Australia. But today we are a massive marine predator. We have 4.6 million fishing vessels, according to the FAO, about 40,000 factory trawlers on the global ocean. We are operating as a super marine predator. This is the largest factory trawler in the world. The Atlantic Dawn used to be called the Annelius Elena. And the latest science, and there are a lot of neat new papers that are sort of snowballing in this direction, but this one is published by Deramont and his team in Communications Biology, looked at how humans compare for both, the x-axis got cut off on this top one, but that should say prey diversity. And then the bottom one is about prey volume. On the left, you see kind of, you see the rates of prey diversity exploitation by other animals in the system compared to humans for food, and then all uses, because we also exploit animals for captive use and aquarium trade, exotic animal trade, parts. And what you should jump out here is, like, even compared to a leopard, humans are orders of magnitude more voracious outside the ecosystem. And we are omnivores. We are terrestrial omnivores, and we have exploitation rates that are higher than those of terrestrial predators or carnivores. All of this, I think, is really neat in the framework of planetary boundaries as to where we sit as humans. That, again, this is a false equivalency to say we are just one other animal within the ecosystem, because we don't look like any other species out there. I would argue within that we could even get finer grained, and we could talk about the industrial fisheries and then the small scale or subsistence fisheries in separate categories. And we've done this on a number of occasions and shown that, you know, according to our best approximation, we have an enormous amount of fuel use, about 37 million tons of fuel going into large scale industrial fisheries compared to only 5 million going into small scale. The small scale fishing sector employs about 25 times more people. It catches about the same amount of food for human consumption. The large scale fisheries also catch an enormous amount of fish for animal feeds. And small scale fisheries have fewer bycatch, and they receive many fewer subsidies from the government than large scale industrial fisheries. So kind of across the board, small scale fisheries are better performers relative to the things that we say we care about. There's also very little attention to end use. So you heard me mention that industrial fisheries, they catch about the same amount for human consumption, but then they also catch an additional, basically another 1/3 of fish for reduction fisheries, going into fish meal, fish oil used to feed aquaculture, pigs, chickens. And some of it also goes into these fish oil supply companies that you can find, you know, to make you think better or live longer or whatever these latest snake oil, fish oil concoctions are. including Antarctic krill. Again, when we think about, oh, well, why are we fishing in Antarctica? No humans live there. Well, we're fishing in part to feed farm salmon and then to make these Antarctic krill oil supplements. So about 20 to 30% of global catch at any given moment is turned into fish meal and fish oil to feed some other animal. And that means it's not going to feed people, whether or not that's the local market or national market of Ecuador here on the left, or the subsistence market here in Ghana on the right. And at the same time, we have to fight against whaling regularly at the IWC, or fight against opening up commercial whaling on the grounds that commercial whaling would help improve fisheries, because whales are taking our fish. So the argument, and it's made consistently across many kinds of predators, is that we should kill sea lions because they take our salmon. We should kill whales because they take our squid. And there are also arguments that we need to actually do more to protect reduction fisheries because of seabirds. The argument has not been made, as far as I can tell, that we should kill seabirds to conserve our fish. But one could imagine something like that happening. So, of course, we live within this global interdependent system. And to me, the idea that that whales are taking our fish is already sort of strange, because of course whales cannot go onto land and take our terrestrial foods, but we of course can go into the ocean to do so. These are marine predators. The other thing I'll mention is that no fishing protected areas represent only about 3% of the global ocean. So on land, about 12% of terrestrial area is under strict protections. In the ocean, only about 3% is protected from fishing. Lots of marine protected areas like the Great Barrier Marine Park actually allow trawling and other forms of industrial fishing inside of them. And the grounds for marine protected areas have often been made on the grounds that they support fishing. That if we protect a certain area of the ocean, that we will see a spillover effect and fisheries will be improved on the outside of those protected areas. There has been less of an argument made that we should protect areas for the sake of protection. It is almost always in the name of this improvement of natural resources. Just very different ways of seeing the ocean versus seeing the land. We know that tourism benefits are huge. In some cases, they are much larger even than the benefits from fishing. In the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, here you see that tourism represents about 37 times more of the value than commercial fishing. So it's not purely an economic argument, is what I'm pointing out. The reason that we're allowing fishing is for some other reason. The reason that I started this talk with, or the reason that I think offers us the greatest possibility of moving forward. And that's a change in the way that we see these animals. It's a change of our perspective, a change in our imagination. If that seems crazy, if it seems like there's no way we're just going to start seeing fish and seafood as animals. These are natural resources. These are commodities. We exploit them. We make money. That is just how it is. We do have another case of this to offer us a path forward. This is very much the model of what happened with whales. In fact, the IWC, as many of you know, was set up as an organization to exploit whales. Less than 40 years later, it becomes an international organization that is largely an anti-whaling organization. In 40 years, a gigantic change in global consciousness around whales. So fascinating. This is Paul Watson, by the way, one of the early founders of Greenpeace, jumping onto the back of a harpooned juvenile sperm whale off the coast of California when the birth of Greenpeace happened. And here you have, just 7 years later, the IWC voting to ban the hunting of whales entirely. So what we did recently was write a report looking across 3 sets of aquatic animals. I thought I would just share this kind of general findings today. Sort of looking at what protections exist for these animals and maybe why and how we got there. For whales, octopuses, and tunas, we thought this offered a different perspective on each. Dale Jamieson is the lead author of this report. I was supporting author, and we had a wonderful team of people helping us with data collection and case studies. And what we established here is this science of agency, sentience, and cognition that I was just mentioning that we have now for fish in spades was very present for whales, as was extinction science or population dynamics. Some of you will be familiar with this kind of research, the MSY model. There were sentinels or very powerful scientists willing to speak up on the animal's behalf. In the case of whales, there were advocates, artists, musicians who were just in favor of anti-whaling. There was cultural resonance. There was strong economic alignment. And then there's something we left out here that I've been thinking more about, which were, in the case of whales, there were regulatory allies. There were people within the regulatory structure or the legal system who were friends with scientists or willing to have in-depth conversation with advocates, and I think learn and implement legal protections that way. If we look at tunas, what I think is interesting is we have a lot of these categories, but only on the population dynamic side. We have scientists who work there, we have people who represent tunas, but not so much on who they are as individuals. We have very little work at all about the agency, sentience, or cognition of tuna. We know mostly about where they go and how many there are. We know very little about the lives of these animals. In octopuses, it's the inverse. We know a lot about who they are as individuals, their incredible abilities, sophistication, play, but we know very little about their population dynamics or risk of extinction. And as a result, we have the protections that we have in place or that are starting for octopuses are much more about the captive setting than they are about a kind of ban on fishing octopuses or catching them. I think this gives us an interesting path forward for where we could contribute scientifically to this conversation. And I'm very interested in building up the work on ASC, for instance, among highly migratory pelagic species. So coming back to Jamieson and Reagan, so again, it was the wake of the IWC decision to ban commercial whaling. It was a reason to celebrate. But Jamieson and Reagan made the argument that we had to go further, that it shouldn't just be about banning commercial whaling, but that we actually needed to understand that whales are not here for us to study or to watch or to play with, but the moral task before us is the most difficult. It is to leave whales alone. And that is another step altogether. So whales are not natural resources anymore, cetacean resources, but they are still very much objects of commodification, of human exploitation, just not for killing. I am curious whether or not we might ever get there for whales or indeed any other aquatic species. But one thing that one study I really like, it looked at the difference between fished no-take and no-entry zones in Australia on their effects on sharks. So what's interesting here is you should expect that no-take and no-entry would have about the same number of sharks in them, density and biomass. Instead, there's a significant difference between the two. And that difference is either a result of poaching or of tourism or other kinds of non-consumptive uses of sharks. And what I think this suggests is that we may want to think about no entry areas, the half Earth idea, protected areas. There's an idea of the Zapovednik in Russia of no entry zones that goes way back to the 19th century. That would again be a form of protection that was about pure decommodification, that this is not even for watching or enjoyment, that this is about coexistence. And I think the study of no entry zones, which of course requires entry, unless you can mount cameras or you could figure out less invasive ways, but is a really also interesting area for future research. So the question I leave you with is whether or not we will be able to do for other aquatic animals what we did for whales, and if so, whether or not the lessons that we learned from whales offer us at all a path forward, or if the world is just a new, explosive, dynamic, impossible to predict place. Thank you.
We have time for questions.
You know, there is one question.
Oh yeah.
That was asked online.
Yes.
If you could share possibly action items that everyday people could take to help with it.
Yeah, action items that everyday people could do to help fish. So I hope that what is clear is that in some ways, the biggest thing that you can do to help fish is change the way you think about them. That each of us has this ability immediately to take action. We can think about them as animals. We can think about them as sentient, as conscious, as feeling pain. Beyond that, I think there are really interesting ways to think about them and sort of do them service in the general conversation, to think about being what it means to be a water breather, for instance, what it means to have a lateral line, what it means to be soft-bodied if you're an octopus, what it means to have a decentralized nervous system. There are just all sorts of really neat thought experiments you can do. You can share and post and just show your family members, the way I do, magnificent videos of fishes playing, of them building nests, of them completing memory tasks. All of this is to break down the idea that these are just commodities, that they are just natural resources, that they, again, have rich lives and do interesting things. Beyond that, of course, there's the question of what you eat, how much you eat, thinking about seafood in the face of all of the planetary challenges is a good thing to do. We've argued, Becca Franks and I recently wrote a chapter on the logical gaps of pescatarianism, you know, that there's really not strong arguments in favor of pescatarianism once you get into the weeds. So there's a lot there. I think that starting with the moral imagination for these animals, starting with who they are, what their lives are like, and then moving into more actionable items, including potentially legislation, supporting it, voting for people who do, is really exciting territory. Thank you. Yes, please.
First of all, thank you very much. I learned quite a few things today, especially the involvement of the major industries. And that's explainable because if there's money to be made, being in a capitalistic system, that's what they do. And you can't stop that. My question is, the way you presented it looks like there's a difference between what rich countries and poor countries. Should we have different standards for these two countries? What do you think?
So when you say standards, what are you referring to specifically?
Well, you know, in many countries, fish is survival.
Yeah.
In this country, it's not.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
Would that change our attitude of what do we say those people who are dependent on fish versus who just
Of course.
luxury item?
Exactly. So, I mean, there's, I hope that I made the case, and very much like the whaling case, which is that I think any action for protection should begin with the industrial sector. Industrial whaling was seen as unethical. Whaling is, of course, still allowed among Aboriginal communities, for instance. There could be easily carve-outs, of course, made for subsistence fishing. Absolutely, that the rich countries are and sort of rich in this domain, right? highly subsidizing their fisheries, highly subsidizing excess capacity. This is exactly where things have to happen first. So there's a very strong argument being made year after year at the WTO to eliminate subsidies to fisheries. This would help enormously in that direction. It keeps excess capacity. The industrial fisheries threaten in many cases the livelihoods of local communities. So the famous examples in West Africa and other places where I worked during my PhD, Tanzania, Mozambique, they're selling off what they see as surplus production in their national waters to European fleets. And first of all, they don't have the surplus because they haven't taken into account the subsistence sectors. But second of all, it's allowing, again, sort of the rich to steal from the poor. So there's a lot of equity concerns that can be brought to bear here. And I think almost all of them work favorably toward not just social justice, but interspecies justice and a better outcome for fish. And it's subsidies. It's also one idea that I've thought of is, could you have legislation that said every fish coming into the United States, because we're net importers of fish, that they'd had to meet the sustainability standards of our own fisheries in the United States. So we always are like, we have the Magnuson-Stevens Act. We are the best, most sustainable fisheries, but we import the vast majority of seafood that we eat, and it does not meet the standards of Magnuson-Stevens. So what if our imports also had to match the same? That would also change things fundamentally. So right now we kind of protect our own fish, but just exploit fish or allow them to be exploited and buy fish from other countries. So I think there's all sorts of interesting policy that could be done that would serve a justice angle. Yeah. Okay.
The first one, it was disappointing to learn the take of nature conservancy. And what work opportunities might there be for a math alum without a doctoral degree?
Yeah, there's I think in the media, a lot of this is about representation. And so the media does represent a lot of the normative frames of science or fisheries journals. I mean, you really have to think of fisheries journals the way you think of animal production journals. They're highly tied to the industry. They are interested in maintaining the industry's perspective. And I think any student, and I think there's a real appetite for a fresh perspective. I think NPR is ready for it. They have other great stories. They're just not all in conversation with one another. The Nature Conservancy could certainly do better. Environmental Defense Fund could certainly do better. There's a growing recognition that we are speaking and thinking about these animals differently. So I think there are opportunities both in the regular NGOs, but also whole new spaces being carved out, like the Aquatic Life Institute, NGOs that are actually wild fish that are dedicated to the questions that we're talking about today, about how do we create better protections for fish? How do we increase welfare standards for fish? That are totally new territories for alum. Please.
So, so there seems to be a lot of possibilities for political alliances and coalitions here because of their social justice issues and ecological issues and potentially animal protection issues. But typically, notwithstanding, most of the animal protection world doesn't want to touch fish at all.
Yeah.
So, what needs to be done to change?
You're certainly right. I mean, that's a major blind spot. That is also an issue. And what's your reason for that? Why do you think that is?
I think that animal protection organizations mostly work on animals people easily relate to, and hence to be fundraising.
Yeah.
You get it. All the
Yeah.
And maybe there is, in the context of what you're talking about, maybe there is a conversation that needs to be had about fish. Different people are in sort of non-human context, in the sense that they see fish as something that people subsist on.
Yeah.
They don't want to offend people with fish, but they'll talk fish.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Bridge the gap. So here's what I've noticed, and anybody is welcome to chime in or disagree. So it seemed to me that the animal protection movement was largely focused on companion animals for a long time, and the RSPCA, and then, you know, large organizations like Humane Society, of course, PETA, taking up the issue now of factory farming and animal production. That also took a long time to sort of percolate up into the animal protection movement. And what is, I'm sure you're aware of, what is sort of weird but also promising is the new area of effective altruism, in which there's a lot of large prominent donors. They are focused on, you know, this very strongly utilitarian reduction of suffering, Bayesian probabilities of consciousness, and they are interested in aquatics. So they are, in some ways, the donor community, these large donors shape, I think, the missions of the NGOs to some extent. And that new perspective has brought aquatics into discussions. I know because I've been working on this since 2005, and Daniel actually really strongly advised me against you know, I would say we shouldn't be eating seafood. And he said, you're going to be outside of the conversation. You really can't be saying things like that. And I'm not outside of the conversation because things have moved in unpredictable fashions over the last 2 decades, basically. So I think it's, I think you're right. And I don't want to downplay that, but I also think the rise of sort of new donors and new groups has made Humane Society, for instance, think a little bit differently right now about fish. So you've seen, like, now we have the first estimates of number of individuals being caught. And you see some groups are talking about the number of individuals being exploited. That never happened before. They only would talk about tonnage if at a minimum, like at a maximum, I mean. So I do think there's an appetite. There's a lot of, I've been on a number of panels about shrimp welfare. I mean, this just didn't happen 10 years ago. And if in 10 years from now, there's more of an emphasis in that direction, I don't know. I really do think anything is possible, but I agree we need to get more people in the room and sort of on the same page. I also think there's real promise for talking about the impacts on other wild animals of fisheries production, that it really isn't just about the animals being exploited. There's an enormous number of innocent bystanders. Yeah, sorry, I know, I think at 10:02 we're supposed to wrap, so.
Yeah, we can move at least one more.
One more question, Joe. I'm here. I just don't want anyone to feel. Anyone has to go, please don't hesitate.
So, the question online is, I have to see farm fish labeled as fresh in retail. Why isn't it also labeled as farmed if it's not wild?
Well, so we do only have voluntary labeling standards in the United States. And the reason why they don't want to label it as farmed is farmed doesn't sell as well as wild. So that's an easy answer, because the economic incentives are not, it's like, why don't we label things as non-organic? Oh, hi, Heidi.
Jennifer, thank you so very much for your exceptional presentation. The IWC 180-degree mindset shift is indeed extraordinary. What international body or bodies do you think are the equivalent targets in the fishing policy / management world for people wanting to advocate for change?
Well, Heidi, I am so glad you brought that up, because I actually do see potential for the IUCN to play not the regulatory role of the IWC, because it does not have regulatory authority, but it has enormous scientific authority. And I do think there's a way in which welfare or some kind of equivalent could be incorporated into IUCN assessments in interesting ways. So right now, the IUCN is responsible really for population assessments of the animals, as well as their the reasons for those declines. And I think even just getting a conversation started about the kind of welfare impacts that these animals face, the right whale being a perfect example of that. I mean, yes, they're here. Yes, they're sort of hanging on as a population. Their daily lives are incredibly degraded. And it's worth thinking about those anthropogenic impacts and what we can do to stop them. And I think if we started thinking like that for the right whale, well, maybe we could start thinking that way about the reef shark. We could start thinking that way about, cleaning up. I think encouraging a culture of care and not just prevention of extinction is something that IUCN is in a really good position to do. But I don't see any immediate IWC equivalent. I don't think the RFMOs are well equipped to do that on the high seas for fisheries. And I don't even have a lot of faith, honestly, in our federal organizations. I think we're going to need a ground up cultural shift of values and mindsets. And then the agencies will hopefully follow suit.
Heidi says, perfect. Let's talk.
I love it. Happy to. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
One final comment.
Okay.
Just a comment, this was a fantastic presentation and such an important yet talked about topic. I've also been extremely bothered by the objective term used to refer to fish. Just because they live underwater doesn't mean they're any less sentient than land animals. In society like the US, with plenty of plant-based food choices, I find it ethically and ecologically irresponsible to take the lives of animals, whether on land or from the sea. Thank you so much for your work.
Well, we agree on that. And actually, I think that the more we explored aquatic animals and their incredible body plans, abilities, the more we would sort of appreciate what it's like to be human too. I think just thinking about these other animals being a water breather would give us a kind of new lot on our own terrestrial lives. So I'm in it. Thank you.